On August 14, 1958, Gladys Presley died of heart failure at the age of 46. Elvis was 23 years old at the peak of his fame, having just been inducted into the U.S. Army. When he received the news that his mother had passed, Elvis collapsed. The bond between Elvis and Gladys had been extraordinarily close, almost obsessive in its intensity. She had been his protector, his confidant, his greatest supporter, and the one person who loved him for who he was rather than what he represented. In the days between Gladys's death and her funeral, Elvis locked himself in a recording studio in Memphis with just one sound engineer. What he recorded there remained a complete secret for nearly 20 years. Not even Colonel Parker knew about it. Not his father Vernon, not his friends, not anyone in his inner circle. It was a recording meant for only one person, and that person was dead. The song Elvis recorded was an original composition written in the 48 hours after his mother's death. Nobody knows exactly what the lyrics were because Elvis never shared them, never wrote them down, never sang the song for another living soul. But according to the sound engineer who was present, a man named Tom Westbrook, who kept the secret until his own death in 1995, the song was the most emotionally raw thing he had ever heard anyone record. Elvis was crying through the entire take, Westbrook said in his final interview. Not just tears running down his face, but sobbing, barely able to get the words out. It took him 7 attempts to record it because he kept breaking down completely. When he finally made it through, I asked him if he wanted to do another take, get a cleaner version. He said no. He said the pain in his voice was part of the message. He said his mama would understand. Elvis took the master tape and had a single copy made onto a cassette. He kept that cassette with him constantly, stored in a locked case that traveled with him everywhere. It became part of a private ritual that Elvis maintained for the remaining 19 years of his life. A ritual that nobody outside his innermost circle knew about or understood. Whenever he visited his mother's grave at Forest Hill Cemetery in Memphis, which he did regularly, often multiple times per week even during the height of his touring schedule, he would bring a portable cassette player and sit by her grave, listening to the song he'd recorded for her. Security guards who accompanied Elvis on these cemetery visits reported that he would cry every single time, without exception. Sometimes he'd play the song once and sit in silence for hours afterward. Sometimes he'd play it on repeat for the entire visit, sitting cross-legged on the ground next to Gladys's headstone, tears streaming down his face, talking to her like she could hear every word he said, responding to her as if she were answering him back from beyond death. Mr. Elvis would sit there and cry and talk to Miss Gladys, said James Roberts, one of Elvis's longtime security team members. He'd tell her about what was happening in his life, about his worries and fears, and he'd play that tape over and over. None of us ever heard what was on it. He always used headphones. But whatever it was, it broke his heart every time he listened to it. Elvis never played the recording for anyone else, not for his wives, not for his daughter Lisa Marie, not for his closest friends. When people asked about his cemetery visits, about what he did there for hours at a time, Elvis would deflect or change the subject. The tape and what was on it belonged to him and his mother alone. It was sacred, private, not meant for the living world. As the years passed and Elvis's life became more complicated, more damaged by prescription drugs and failed marriages and the crushing weight of his own legend, his relationship with that secret recording seemed to intensify rather than fade. He carried the cassette with him everywhere he went, kept it in a special case lined with velvet, guarded it obsessively like it was the most valuable possession he owned. There were stories of Elvis firing staff members who accidentally touched the case, convinced they were trying to steal it or listen to what was inside without permission. By the mid-1970s, when Elvis's health was clearly failing and those close to him knew his death was approaching faster than anyone wanted to admit, he became increasingly fixated on the idea of death and reunion with his mother. He talked about it constantly with the people close to him, expressing his absolute belief that death wasn't an ending, but a transition to something better. Somewhere he'd be reunited with Gladys, and they'd finally be together again the way they were meant to be. Elvis believed in heaven absolutely, said Charlie Hodge. And he believed his mama was there waiting for him. He talked about it all the time, especially toward the end. He said when he died, he'd finally get to see her again, finally get to be with her the way they were supposed to be together. The secret recording became part of Elvis's eschatology, his personal theology about death and afterlife. He apparently believed that the song he'd recorded was meant to be shared with Gladys in heaven, not on earth. It was a message, a communication, a piece of his soul that he'd preserved for the moment when they'd be reunited. In early 1977, Elvis added a specific provision to his will. The document, witnessed by his lawyer and sealed until after his death, contained instructions about the secret recording. When Elvis died, the cassette tape was to be buried with Gladys, placed in her grave, returned to the person it had been intended for all along. Elvis died on August 16, 1977, almost exactly 19 years after his mother's death, as if some cosmic clock had been counting down to their reunion. He was 42 years old. In the chaos that followed his death, as the world mourned and Memphis was overwhelmed with grieving fans camping outside Graceland's gates, Elvis's closest associates dealt with the private, painful details of his funeral and estate. Vernon Presley, Elvis's father who had remarried after Gladys's death but never stopped loving her, was the executor of the will. When he read the specific provision about the secret recording, he was completely confused. He'd never heard of any special tape for Gladys, never knew Elvis had recorded anything in those dark days after her death. But as he searched through Elvis's personal effects at Graceland, he found it in Elvis's bedroom, in a locked case that Elvis had always kept on his nightstand, treating it with more care and reverence than any of his gold records or awards. The case was marked with a simple label in Elvis's handwriting: "For Mama, do not open, do not play." Vernon wanted to listen to it desperately, wanted to know what his son had recorded for his wife, wanted to understand this secret Elvis had kept for nearly 2 decades, wanted to hear the words Elvis had needed to say to Gladys that he couldn't say to anyone else. But the will was explicit and absolutely clear. The tape was not to be played by anyone, ever. It was to be buried with Gladys immediately, before anyone could be tempted to violate Elvis's wishes or listen to what he'd intended to remain private forever. On August 18, 1977, the same day Elvis was buried in the meditation garden at Graceland, a small private ceremony took place at Forest Hill Cemetery several miles away. Vernon, Priscilla, and Lisa Marie, who was only 9 years old, along with a cemetery official, opened Gladys's grave in the early morning hours before the media could discover what was happening. It was done quietly, away from the massive circus surrounding Elvis's funeral, with only a handful of people aware it was even taking place. The sealed cassette tape, still in its case, still marked with Elvis's handwriting, was placed in a waterproof container and buried with Gladys. The grave was resealed, and the secret that Elvis had kept for 19 years was literally buried with the woman it had been intended for. For years, nobody talked publicly about the buried recording. It was mentioned briefly in some biographies, noted as a curiosity in Elvis's will, but never explained or explored in detail. Most people assumed it was just another eccentricity of a troubled man, not understanding the depth of meaning it held for Elvis, or the profound statement it made about love and loss and the bonds that transcend death. It wasn't until 2003, in a private interview that later became public, that Lisa Marie Presley finally explained what the buried recording meant to her father. She was 35 years old, had lived with the knowledge of the tape her entire life, carried the weight of this family secret for decades, and finally felt ready to share its significance with the world that had loved and consumed her father. "My father loved his mother in a way that was almost religious," Lisa Marie said. "She was his anchor, his everything. When she died, part of him died with her. He never fully recovered. That recording he made for her, it wasn't meant for this world. It was meant for the next one. He wanted to share it with her in heaven, not here. That's why he never let anyone hear it, why he buried it with her. It was sacred." Lisa Marie explained that Elvis had told her about the recording when she was young, though he'd never let her hear it or even describe what was in it, beyond saying it was something special for Grandma Gladys. He'd explained that it was a song about his love for his mother, about his grief over losing her, about his absolute belief that death was just a temporary separation, and they'd be together again someday in a place where pain and loss didn't exist. Daddy believed that when he died, he'd be with Grandma again, Lisa Marie said, her voice emotional even 26 years after her father's death. And when they were reunited in heaven, she'd finally get to hear the whole song the way he intended it to be heard, without the interference of the physical world, without the pain and the tears and the grief that made it so hard for him to sing it here on earth. Just pure love and music in heaven, shared between a mother and son who'd been separated too long. The idea that Elvis recorded a song specifically to be shared in the afterlife struck many people as bizarre, delusional, the product of grief and prescription drug use. But those who knew Elvis understood. His relationship with Gladys had been the most important relationship of his life. Everything else, all his fame and success and relationships, were secondary to that fundamental bond. And if he wanted to preserve something special for their reunion in whatever came after death, that made perfect sense within the emotional logic of his life. In 1977, shortly after the burial of the recording, there was apparently a brief but intense discussion about exhuming it from Gladys's grave. Several prominent music historians and Elvis biographers wanted access to the tape, arguing it was culturally significant, that it deserved to be preserved and studied as an important piece of musical history, that the world had a right to hear everything Elvis had created. Vernon Presley refused absolutely and without any room for negotiation. Elvis wanted it buried with his mama, Vernon said firmly to anyone who asked. That's where it's staying. Some things are more important than history or money or fame. Some things are sacred. When Vernon died in 1979, just 2 years after his son, there was another attempt by various parties to gain legal access to the recording. The Presley estate again refused to even consider the request. Elvis's will was clear and specific. The tape was to remain buried with his mother forever. And more importantly, respecting his wishes meant honoring the sacred nature of what he'd created and the privacy he'd fought so hard to maintain around his deepest grief. Over the years, some people have questioned whether the recording even existed, suggesting it might have been a legend, a story that grew in the telling. But too many people saw the tape, knew about Elvis's cemetery visits, witnessed the provision in his will. The recording was real. It existed. And now it rests in a grave in Forest Hill Cemetery, in a waterproof container protected from decay, waiting for a reunion that Elvis believed would come in death. The story of Elvis's buried recording reveals something profound about the relationship between art and privacy in an age of celebrity. Elvis Presley was the most famous man in the world, someone whose every move was documented, whose life was consumed by public appetite. But even in the midst of that all-consuming fame, he maintained one completely private space, one piece of himself that remained unseen and unheard. The recording wasn't about sharing his grief with the world. It wasn't about creating art for others to consume. It was about maintaining a connection with the person who'd loved him before he was Elvis Presley, who'd loved him when he was just a poor boy from Tupelo, who'd loved him for himself rather than for what he represented. In burying the recording with his mother, Elvis was making a statement about what matters most, not fame, not commercial success, not even sharing his art with the world. What mattered most was love, was family, was the sacred bond between mother and son that transcended death and would, he believed, continue in whatever came next. Today, that recording remains buried in Forest Hill Cemetery. Nobody alive has heard it. Nobody ever will, unless someone violates Elvis's wishes and his mother's grave. And maybe that's exactly as it should be. Maybe some art isn't meant to be shared. Maybe some expressions of love are too private, too sacred, too personal to be consumed by the public, even when they come from the most public figure of his generation. Elvis Presley gave the world countless recordings, performances, moments of musical genius that changed popular culture forever. But the recording he buried with his mother, that one wasn't for us. It was for her. And in death, as Elvis believed would happen, it would finally reach its intended audience in a place where grief doesn't exist, and love is eternal. The cassette tape in Gladys Presley's grave represents the one piece of Elvis that remained truly his, the one expression of himself that he never commodified, never shared, never allowed to be consumed by the machinery of fame that defined his life. And in protecting that privacy, in honoring his wish to keep that recording buried, we honor not just Elvis, but the sacred nature of grief, of love, and of the bonds that define us more deeply than any public achievement ever could.